Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is the really challenging issue of non-consensual intimate imagery, sometimes called image-based sexual abuse, or IBSA. It's a devastating global problem, and the source material highlights the severe psychological harm, things like PTSD, anxiety, profound social isolation. Now, the legal landscape is trying to catch up, but there's a key strategic question we need to tackle. What's the most critical legal priority? Should it be building robust criminal accountability for deterrence? Or should we focus first on immediate, victim-centered civil remedies and technological controls? I'll be arguing that criminalization is really the essential foundation here. It's about deterrence, yes, but also societal recognition of IBSA as a serious form of sexual abuse.
And I'll be taking a different perspective. While I absolutely agree on the gravity of the act, I believe our primary legal focus needs to be on minimizing the ongoing harm to the victim, right now, immediately. So I'll argue that quick, accessible civil remedies, strong statutory damages, and importantly, proactive tech solutions give victims the fastest path back to regaining control and starting that psychological recovery. You know, criminal cases can drag on. Relief needs to be much faster.
Okay, I understand that pull towards immediate relief. It's very compelling. But I think we first have to grapple with the fundamental nature of this act. NCII isn't just, a privacy slip-up or a data issue. The evidence consistently frames it as a form of sexual abuse, often used in domestic violence contexts, really rooted in a desire for power and control. In criminal law, well, it's the main tool society has to reflect that level of severity and to establish serious systemic deterrence. We've actually seen this shift in thinking drive new laws. Something like 49 U.S. states plus D.C. now have specific statutes. Remember the Hunter Moore case?
Vaguely, yes. The revenge porn kingpin, wasn't he?
Exactly. And despite that label, prosecutors couldn't convict him for the actual image abuse itself. They had to use secondary charges like hacking and conspiracy. That really highlighted the legal vacuum at the time. The system just didn't recognize the core crime.
Right. And that kind of frustration, I think, spurred the legislative changes you mentioned.
Precisely. And that momentum demands real teeth, strong sanctions, felony classifications like you see in Illinois with a Class 4 felony or Nevada's Category D felony. They send a clear message. When Kevin Bullard got that 18-year sentence, it wasn't just about punishing him. It signaled a systemic commitment to treating this with the seriousness it deserves. And now with the explosion of AI deepfakes, we absolutely need criminal laws, like the Federal Take It Down Act from last year, that specifically criminalize even the threat or distribution of these fakes, that targets a malicious intent, not just the image itself.
That's a fair point about moral condemnation and needing strong sentences as a signal. But you see, when we lean too heavily, maybe exclusively on the criminal system, I worry we often fail the victim in the short term, in the immediate aftermath. My position really centers on that psychological impact. Survivors consistently report things like PTSD, this chronic loss of self-worth, loss of control. So the legal system needs to offer immediate relief, not just the possibility of eventual justice years down the line. Criminal proceedings, as we know, they're often incredibly slow. They can take years. And they often bring about, unwanted publicity, which can re-traumatize the victim. On top of that, convictions can be really hard to secure. There are high evidentiary hurdles, especially proving that specific malicious intent. Civil remedies, on the other hand, are designed to focus squarely on the victim's immediate needs. They can provide fast injunctions to stop the spread, crucial privacy protections like using Jane Doe in federal cases, and, critically, significant financial accountability. That federal civil cause of action under VOWA 2022, it allows victims to potentially recover damages and their legal fees, which can shift the power dynamic considerably.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit on that financial accountability piece? How significant can it be?
Sure. We're already seeing major examples. Look at that Texas verdict in 2023, $1.2 billion. Now, that wasn't just about the money itself. It was a powerful statement about how the legal system values or should value this kind of profound psychological damage. It showed that this abuse can lead to, financially catastrophic consequences for the perpetrator. And when you pair these legal tools with proactive tech solutions like StopNCII.org's hashing tool, which is really clever, It helps platforms block re-uploads without anyone ever needing to see the actual image. You give the victim immediate power. That restoration of privacy and control right away, that's a vital part of the healing process itself.
Okay, I hear you on the immediacy, but I have to push back a little on this idea that the evidentiary hurdles in criminal law are just an obstacle we should try to sidestep. I actually think that specific intent requirement, proving intent to harm, harass, humiliate, is essential precisely because it defines IBSA as sexual abuse, not just, an accident or a breach of confidence. States like Oregon and Colorado require proving that intent because it forces the legal system to confront the emotional devastation. And the evidence is overwhelming. Up to 93% of victims experience major emotional distress. If we dilute that intent requirement for expediency, we risk, trivializing the abuse, maybe equating it to something less severe. Look at the UK's 2015 Act. It specifically created an offense, maximum 2 years, based on the intent to cause distress. That's a strong model. It validates the victim's experience of deliberate malice through the criminal code.
I'm sorry, but I just don't see how that high bar for proving intent actually serves the victim in most practical situations. That exact requirement is what makes successful prosecutions so challenging and, frankly, quite rare. Think about the practicalities. Legal advice often points out, like in Ohio, for example, that if you can't examine the physical evidence, maybe the video was deleted, or if all you have is a verbal admission, which is often dismissed as hearsay, well, the investigation might just stall right there. Victims frequently tell us they prioritize getting the images down above all else, often more than enduring a long, uncertain criminal trial that might end without a conviction. And if you look at places that focus heavily on criminal prosecution, like South Korea, the actual jail rates for these specific crimes are surprisingly low, something like only 8.7% of those convicted actually serve jail time. So, if deterrence relies on the threat of jail, and that threat only becomes reality less than 10% of the time, well, are we truly deterring effectively, or are we just creating a slow, burdensome process for the victim? Civil law, in contrast, is often more practical. It can rely on easier-to-prove breaches, like the equitable obligation of confidence.
Right. Can you just quickly clarify for listeners what you mean by that, the equitable obligation of confidence?
Of course. Yeah, it's basically a standard from common law. The Australian Wilson v. Ferguson case is a key example. It's often much easier to establish in civil court. It simply asks, was there a relationship or situation where privacy was reasonably expected? It kind of bypasses the whole difficult issue of proving criminal malice. The focus shifts to the broken trust, the breached expectation, not the perpetrator's specific state of mind, which can be incredibly hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
That's a useful clarification, and I acknowledge the difficulty in proving criminal intent. However, I'd argue the bigger systemic hurdle, the one that often makes even successful civil suits feel incomplete, is the immunity granted to the tech platforms themselves. I mean, you could win $1 billion judgment, but if the images stay online, accessible, the harm continues, right?
We absolutely have to confront CDA Section 230. It effectively shields platforms from liability for user-posted content, making NDII a federal crime, which was a key argument behind the Intimate Privacy Protection Act proposal, is so critical because federal crimes are one of the few explicit exceptions to Section 230 immunity. This seems like the clearest path to actually compel platforms, Google, social media networks, you name it, to take down this abusive material reliably. The current federal civil action under VAWA 2022, it's just too narrow.
It only holds platforms liable if they solicited the content or if their main business is basically dealing in revenge porn. That leaves most mainstream platforms off the hook, potentially making a civil win against the abuser a hollow victory if the content remains visible.
I definitely see why bypassing Section 230 via federal criminalization is attractive. But we are actually seeing some success getting around platform immunity through other avenues already. For instance, civil suits based on copyright infringement, which works if the victim actually took the photo or video themselves. The selfie scenario that already bypasses Section 230, copyright infringement is an established statutory exception. And we also have to think about the perpetrator situation. Civil remedies work well if the person has assets. But what about intimate partner violence cases where the abuser might have no money? Isn't criminal accountability perhaps the only real consequence in that scenario, since a huge civil judgment might be uncollectible? But even then, industry responsibility is stepping up, which helps mitigate the harm regardless of the perpetrator's finances. Google and Microsoft, for example, they voluntarily remove links to NCII when reported. And tools like stopncii.org, working proactively with platforms using that hashing tech I mentioned, prevent re-uploads altogether. This kind of preemptive action can stop the spread without needing a potentially complex cross-border legal battle, which can be, as people often say, a jurisdictional nightmare. Perpetrator in one country, server in another, victim in a third. Just focusing on a criminal statute kind of ignores these immediate, practical digital safety measures we can use now through industry cooperation and existing civil levers.
Relying on voluntary cooperation from tech companies, though, that feels inherently shaky. We're talking about sexual abuse. We shouldn't have to depend on the goodwill of Silicon Valley. We need the legal force, the coercion that criminalization provides. And let's tackle the elephant in the room. AI deepfakes. This technology really complicates, maybe even undermines, several of the main civil remedies you're championing, especially copyright. How can a victim claim copyright on an image that doesn't actually exist, that was fabricated? And what image can a court order destroyed? This is where criminal law, specifically targeting the creation and the threat of dissemination, like New York State ban or the Federal Take It Down Act, becomes absolutely critical. It shifts the focus to the malicious act of fabricating and threatening, regardless of whether a real image ever existed. It establishes that the intent to create and spread a harmful fake is in itself a serious crime. That moves the legal focus from just the content to the malicious action behind it, which is, I think, a core function of the criminal justice system protecting people from intentional harm.
Okay, deepfakes definitely demand strong criminal deterrence. I agree. But this complexity actually reinforces the need for adaptable civil actions, too. We have to make sure civil laws are broad enough to cover damages for these digital forgeries. Arkansas, for instance, has statutes now that potentially allow victims to sue the providers or developers of the AI image generation tools if they didn't have reasonable safeguards in place. It's about extending liability up the chain. But let's circle back quickly to that jurisdictional nightmare point. Criminal cases often get bogged down in extradition, complex international treaties. Civil injunctions, especially from federal courts, can sometimes be enforced more quickly across borders against large platforms, because those companies have a global legal presence. And maybe we should look at models that try to blend approaches. Australia is often cited here.
Commissioner with real power to enforce civil penalties and order content removal. That kind of multi-pronged strategy offers victims several complementary routes to justice. It recognizes that, realistically, no single legal theory is going to be a silver bullet against technology that changes this fast.
I'd agree the Australian model offers a promising blend, but I still maintain that the fundamental legal force, the ultimate backstop, has to be criminal law. Without that clear foundational condemnation of the act as a crime, civil remedies risk becoming, for some perpetrators, just a cost of doing business, especially for those motivated by power or humiliation, not money. Real systemic change, I believe, requires those robust criminal statutes and dedicated enforcement to send an unmistakable message and help dismantle the culture of power and control that fuels this abuse. Criminalization ensures society recognizes the severity, regardless of borders or whether the perpetrator has assets.
And I would argue that an effective response absolutely must put power back into the victim's hands immediately. It has to acknowledge the deep psychological harm, the chronic fear, the loss of control. And that's best achieved through civil remedies that are accessible, that can grant substantial damages and immediate injunctions, working hand in hand with cutting-edge tech defenses to restore privacy and ease that constant anxiety. These non-criminal routes often provide a more direct and potentially less re-traumatizing path to justice for the survivor, prioritizing getting the content down first and foremost.
Ultimately, I think our discussion and the source material make it clear this is an incredibly complex,
ongoing fight against a truly pervasive global problem. We probably have to conclude that both strong criminal accountability and immediate victim-focused civil and technological solutions are essential. They both need to be part of the toolkit to fully address the immense psychological, social, and even professional damage caused by NCCI.
Agreed. It's not an either-or situation. The complexity of the problem demands a multifaceted, adaptable response. We need continued investment in innovation across all these fronts, legal, technological, societal, to combat this effectively and ensure that every victim has multiple, viable pathways towards justice, safety, and, hopefully, healing.